listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-George and I am a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today is the first of a two-part conversation with Adam Hearne, CEO and co-founder of CarbonChain. CarbonChain helps companies and banks decarbonise their supply chains through its software, which provides precise accounting of the global carbon emissions caused by making, shipping, and using critical commodities and products. Adam is an expert in the optimization of supply chains. His previous roles include Senior Program Manager Supply Chain at Amazon and Innovation Advisor at Rio Tinto. This week's theme is value chains and managing your carbon emissions. Value chains can be drivers of climate change and lead to issues such as water insecurity and deforestation, which is already impacting companies. Around 90% of an organization's environmental impact lies in their value chain, whether that's upstream in their supply chains or downstream in the post-production use phase. This is why analyzing and taking action on a company's value chain carbon emissions is one of the most important ways a business can reduce its environmental impact. Businesses who source carbon-intensive commodities, such as manufacturers, commodity traders, logistics firms, and trade finance providers, have faced increasing pressure to take responsibility for tackling climate change by accelerating decarbonisation across their value chain. Once a company has measured its emissions, it can identify carbon hotspots where focus will lead to the most meaningful reductions. This may involve working with suppliers to reduce emissions or buying a larger percentage of inputs from low-carbon suppliers. It may also involve on-site efficiencies to reduce material losses or to make products last longer. Reducing carbon emissions across the value chain does not come without its challenges. Companies may need to rely on their suppliers' emissions reporting, which can be incomplete or non-existent. Methodologies for value chain carbon accounting may require expertise many businesses do not have in-house. And this is why companies like CarbonChain help businesses manage the risk of carbon-intensive supply chains by helping them access accurate and efficiently calculated data when analysing their carbon footprint. However, while the policy landscape across many parts of the world has evolved to regulate carbon emissions more stringently, and stakeholder demand for companies to tackle climate change has risen, sustainability policy priorities in the EU, the USA, and other parts of the world are in flux. So, what impact is this going to have on businesses? To hopefully shed more light on the topic and answer that question, I'd like to welcome Adam. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about value chains, carbon emissions, and the global ESG regulatory environment. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming. To get started, could I ask you to tell us a bit more about what you do at CarbonChain?
Yeah, Kivati, thanks for having me on. So CarbonChain tracks the world's emissions with a focus on industrial sectors, oil and gas, metals and minerals, agriculture, and simple manufacturing. These sectors are responsible for over 80% of the world's emissions, and we've been able to take a very focused approach on these areas so that we can help our customers simplify the demands of carbon accounting and manage the risks that go with it.
So, I wanted to ask, why did you set up the company? Was it in part because there was such an opportunity there with the oil and gas sector specifically?
We did have, in the founder team, we did have experience in oil and gas and metals and minerals. For me personally, I spent 12 years at Rio Tinto, ultimately doing economic modeling and looking at assets that supply materials that make modern life possible as we know it, and also looking at supply chains as a career. I was with Amazon working across 8 countries for them in Europe and grew to appreciate that 80% or more of the world's emissions are actually contained in supply chains. So we had a unique advantage as a company to tackle scope 3, so-called supply chain emissions, and make a business out of it.
Yep, thank you for defining those for me already. I'm sure we'll talk about scope 3 a lot today. On your website, it says that you want to transition the world's supply chain to a net zero economy. So could you expand on that and why this is one of your mission statements?
Thanks for asking. The world's supply chain, as we see it, is just an incredible way to summarize the activity of global GDP. We think of supply chains as a portal into human activity, economic activity. So as we set up a platform that tracks these emissions, that is the ultimate way, in our view, to look at transition risk and decarbonization, and ultimately helping us tackle climate change more effectively. And so by tackling the world's supply chains, we're going back to back to cradle, literally Mother Nature's cradle, and tracking emissions for our customers from cradle to their gate and beyond to give them a comprehensive view of their emissions and, importantly, what they can do to reduce their emissions in supply chains, which is no easy feat, and getting started is often half the challenge.
Indeed. So, what particular sectors does CarbonChain focus on?
So, um, oil and gas going back to back to field, um, and a lot of what we would call primary industries. So, that is the real economy, um, metals from the ground up, the different products that come downstream from that, and the way that they're manufactured to become something more useful that we might recognize, like an iPhone, from its materials ultimately to a simple product that we use in day-to-day life, is often quite a big stretch to imagine, but we follow that for our customers and help them do that. And then we also specialize on the transport links between doing all this work. And so we have some very good insight into shipping, trucking, barging, land transport. That's the glue that gives you a very good end-to-end supply chain summary.
Great, thank you. So, as I outlined in the introduction, tackling these value chains emissions is one of the most important ways a business can reduce its environmental impact. But as you said, it can be challenging. So, how do you start helping companies with this dilemma? Where do you begin when you take on a client?
It is such a challenge for a company to measure its supply chain emissions. I think COVID reminded the world just how difficult it is to know
Mm,
where things come from. And so, where we start with a client is helping them understand the provenance of their supply chain. What's the ultimate source of what they're buying? And that's very powerful. Information is power in this regard, in that our customers can get our help to look at that chain of custody all the way from the origin. So, getting the best scope 3 supply chain footprint possible is a function of us helping them navigate upstream
mhm.
specifically. There is a lot more emissions upstream for many of our customers, and giving them that audit trail so that they can then properly audit their own emissions and manage the risks that are inherent in those upstream supply chains.
So, how do you begin that process? Because I imagine that you have a lot of clients who have never measured their scope 3 emissions before, right? So, do you tap into kind of publicly available resources? How does the process begin when you're working with a client?
First step is to get an understanding of the products that the client creates. So if they're creating construction materials like steel rebar, or more complicated goods like heavy mobile equipment, yellow goods, JCB diggers, like we might be familiar with over here in London, London, UK, where we're based as CarbonChain headquarters. And we then look at the materials and go back to the primary sources of those materials. So we'll need to see the original bills of lading that a company might get for delivery of goods, because that's a legal document that has the origin of goods confirmed.
Mm.
And from there, we have a very good database of the world's assets. So there are a defined a set number of assets that produce most of the world's emissions. We have those at CarbonChain and help trace our customers' goods back to those known assets in the world, like steel factories, aluminium smelters, coal mines. Yes, referring to coal, we still need to have visibility of it because it is involved in a lot of industrial processes. And knowing what a lot of these initial stages of production are for materials in the world gives us the ability to then create that view for our customers.
Thanks for laying that out because I think a lot of people wouldn't know that that's where you begin. That I was curious myself to kind of ask what databases and things that you access. That's super interesting. Um, could you provide a few case studies on how you've helped companies? And kind of as a side question, you're based in London in the UK, but I think if I understand correctly, you work with people from all over. If I understood correctly.
Yeah, we have an office in New York as well,
Mhm.
and we service customers all over the world in many different countries and different jurisdictions. One thing we have learnt about global trade is that it is truly global. There are
Mm.
many countries that we cover, almost agnostic to certain regulations out there. There are Most trade routes are affected by some regulation in some place or another, and so they need to align to a common denominator. So yeah, we service the most common trade hubs in the world, and by default, most countries in the world except for North Korea.
Okay, great. So could you give us an example of some of the companies that you've worked with and how you've helped them navigate carbon accounting and their supply chain?
Yeah, thank you. So one good case study we had was a steel manufacturer who was needing to provide so-called green steel or low carbon steel to one of their customers. And there was an incredibly high premium that that customer was willing to pay for lower carbon steel. Normally, this would have been a straightforward transaction, a commoditized transaction in a way. Steel is steel, but they were able to use CarbonChain to differentiate that their steel was lower carbon and lower than the industry average by an order of magnitude, and they were able to command a double-digit percentage premium on those goods and ultimately generate more sales. And so they were able to secure a seven-figure contract, a seven-figure purchase by using CarbonChain. Another example is traders using CarbonChain to get lower interest rates for their lines of credit. So
Mm,
banks are able to pass on interest rate reductions, interest rate discounts to companies that are aware of what their financed emissions are, because that is also scope 3 emissions, your financed emissions as a bank. So banks use us as well as traders that borrow from banks.
that's yeah, very interesting. Do you have any examples in shipping? Because disclosure, I've worked with Carbon Chain in the past, and I know that this is something that you work on. I'm just interested in it as a sector because um, I know that it is often kind of seen as a sector that is very carbon intensive, and so I wondered if you had any examples of areas that you've worked in shipping.
Shipping is definitely carbon intensive. It's also very visible.
Mm,
It does account
indeed.
for a couple of percentage points of the world's emissions, depending on what study you look at. It can be 2 to 3% of the world's emissions, and there are roughly 90,000 commercial ships out there that move a lot of the goods around, and then another 50,000 or so smaller scale ships that are used for different purposes. So you can get a view of the ocean's emissions by knowing roughly 140,000 ships really well. We noticed
Oh,
that
wow.
90,000 ships are the most used, and we're able to compare the performance of those individual ships down to IMO number and see how the types of ship configurations, the age, and the maintenance of them can change the emissions profiles of ships. So, in a competitive situation where you've got a shipping broker who is trying to offer spot shipping services, we can help companies navigate that market by
Hmm.
helping them identify lower carbon intensity ships based on the emissions per ton per nautical mile of cargo transported. And there are a lot of hidden factors that change a ship's intensity. Sometimes it just has a dirty hull as it's cutting through the water. It can be 20% less efficient than a equivalent ship with the same design, the same age. It is really quite eye-opening once you dig into the details, and there is a market for lower carbon shipping routes that we can
Hmm.
help customers identify.
Oh, I love the granular level of detail that you're providing here. I had no idea that a ship with a dirty hull could be 20% less efficient.
Yeah, the
Super
barnacles
interesting.
that build up and they need to be cleaned.
Do you need help with your barnacles? Call on Carbon Chain. That could be your tagline. No, thank you. That's super interesting. And I think it's not you're not only helping companies become more environmentally friendly, so shall we say, or guide them towards a way in which they could be. I mean, you are helping them save money or gain money from the sounds of things, from the examples that you've given, where they people looking for more sustainable options, thanks to your help, have got a contract and are getting lower financed emissions. I wonder how many people know about that. So thanks for those examples. Um, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great insight, and thanks for summarizing. It's a very good time for business leaders to think about their carbon exposure because
Mm,
commercially it does help as a business. You can get a cheaper cost of business, and also the opportunities you get to sell more and to have a presence in the market. You can amplify that message by thinking of a way to know what your carbon emissions are. So, sustainable business is commercially sustainable more than it's ever been.
I could not agree more, and I would advise listeners to go and listen to the last episode of the previous season where Anush Sauj and I discussed that exact topic. And I'm glad you've gotten into that topic as well, Adam, because my last question for you as we finish part one is, as I hinted at in the introduction, we're obviously recording this episode in arguably politically volatile times. We're in June 2025, and certain political leaders' rhetoric is denigrating sustainability-related topics and influencing policy. And there's a lot of especially kind of once again conflating competitiveness with being anti-sustainability, which is very frustrating personally. I'd really like to discuss policy with you in more depth in part two, but to finish off part one, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this shift and how you see the regulatory landscape evolve over the next few years in the UK, in Europe, and worldwide.
In the UK and Europe, we're going to see a coupling of those economies. So the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is enforced. And as we speak, and as we've already gone through the Trump's administration, that still stands, and I anticipate it'll still stand by the time this episode is aired. And increasingly, the UK will follow the same format 1 year on. So in 2026 and 2027, we're seeing real regulatory teeth in the form of fines for non-compliance and other issues for people trying to do business that aren't complying to the European carbon border regulations. And equally across the world, we're seeing a greater reliance on disclosure of your scope 3 carbon emissions, your supply chain risk, your carbon risk, knowing that there is a carbon price emerging in many countries from Canada to Singapore to the UK and the EU. The presence of this global carbon price is creating a need to manage your carbon risk, and that is making an enduring need for carbon emissions reporting. And so we'll be able to talk a bit more specifically in episode 2 on the policies behind that, and also the different methodologies out there to make sure you're future-proofing your business for a carbon-aware economy in future.
Great. But so focusing on carbon specifically, so you're still, I don't know if the word is optimistic, but you still believe that despite kind of the instability in the world, the regulation is going to continue going at pace, and that it makes more business sense for businesses to really focus on their carbon hotspots.
Yeah, I definitely think there is carbon exposure that you need to identify now. We're helping a lot of clients actually take advantage of this moment where it's often put to the side, brushed to the side, given the macro level commentary. But the fundamentals, if you're a business that is intending to survive for more than 5 or 10 years, you actually need to take that time horizon and know where your lower carbon supply chains are versus your higher carbon supply chains. There are other risks with higher carbon supply chains, just like aging infrastructure and expensive energy. If you compare the cost of renewable energy, it's just getting cheaper every year. So over time, a lower carbon supply chain will actually be indicative of a lower cost supply chain, and those fundamentals are strengthening each year, which is an incredible trend. And so it's wise for companies to now move in and try to make sure they're aware of where they're purchasing from, and to that we're helping companies secure incredible positions in almost hedging in some respects by securing long-term supply from very low carbon suppliers that will future-proof them to protect against carbon taxes or other carbon border costs that many other market participants aren't aware of right now. So there's a bit of a gold rush, you could say, to secure low carbon supply when the world is quite distracted on a lot of other political commentary.
Great, thank you. The time is now, it seems, so thank you for wrapping that up in that way. Thank you, Adam, for joining us today. This is the first of a 2-part episode, so join us next time for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.